everyone. This is David Frederick, and thanks for taking the time to kind of watch through this presentation and kind of mini masterclass. I've given this presentation several times at some trade events and Synthplex and for the Alan R. Perlman Foundation. And one of the first questions I always get asked is, would I make this available on YouTube or online? And so I thought I would go ahead and do that and share this with you. So why don't we get started talking about using the ARP 2600 in visual media scoring. So the things we'll talk about in this kind of presentation is we'll start with the opening piece of music. This is a piece of music I whipped up for this presentation called Horizons, kind of illustrating or demonstrating the use of the 2600 with orchestral music in a visual scoring kind of environment. So hopefully you enjoyed that. The other thing I think is really important is the objective of this presentation, which is really to inspire and enable composers, musicians, and producers to embrace the 2600 and other analog synthesizers, but in this particular case, the 2600, in a more broader, more creative, and inspirational manner. I'll tell you a little bit about me and my background. I'll give you my perspective on the 2600. We'll talk about something that I refer to as the sonic palette. We'll talk a little bit about Synthesis 101 for the composer. Again, we won't do a deep dive into subtractive synthesis, but I wanted to share kind of my perspective on it, which hopefully you can take something away from it and it enables you to maybe dial up patches a lot quicker or be able to program a little bit quicker. We'll also go through a bunch of use case examples of visual media scoring with the 2600, and I've kind of taken what I call the overt and the subtle approach. So the overt is where you're going to really hear the 2600 as a prominent instrument in the piece of music, and then the other one, I've used the 2600 in a much more subtle way, and we'll talk about that and take a listen to that. Finally, we'll talk about some best practices and from a technical and practical standpoint. Some of them may be obvious to you, some may not be, but hopefully you'll be able to take something away from those. I'll tell you a little bit about my philosophy on thinking differently, and I'll also give you my opinion on real versus clone versus VST and what my choice is. In this particular setting, we won't be able to do Q&As, but again, I hope you'll be able to take something away from my experience and the way I kind of work with these instruments, and it will enable you to be more successful in the work that you do. So why don't we get started? I'll tell you a little bit about me. I started playing the keyboards at the age of 2. I literally grew up in the electronic music industry. I was blessed that my father was one of the original 7 guys that started ARP Synthesizer. So for me, I grew up playing the 2600, the Pro Soloist, the Odyssey, the String Ensemble at a very early age. So synthesizers have been a huge part of my life, literally from the very beginning all the way through to today. I am a film and television composer. I'm also a keyboard player and synthesist. I also do a lot of sound design as well. So I've been very lucky in my career to be able to kind of do a variety of different things sonically and as a musician. Just high level, kind of the ego slides, my resume. As I said, I've done a lot of film and television work. I've also done a lot of music composition for games and for commercial work as well. From a sound design and synthesizer programmer, aside from doing session work, I've also done a tremendous amount of work for companies like Akai Professional, Kurzweil, sound design for the Hollywood Edge and Sound Deluxe and so forth and so on. So now that we got those guys out of the way, why don't we talk about the 2600? So what is the 2600? Well, it was a synthesizer that ARP put out in the early 70s. It went through a variety of iterations. It's a semi-modular monophonic synthesizer with 3 oscillators, uses subtractive synthesis. And frankly, from my perspective, it truly is a badass, iconic synthesizer. There's nothing else out there, in my opinion, that sounds like a 2600. And you can tell when somebody refers to an instrument as iconic. You just have to look at the people that have used this instrument throughout their careers. And it's some of the biggest names in entertainment, right? I mean, we're looking at Stevie Wonder, Pete Townsend, Herbie Hancock, Joe Zawinul, um, on and on and on. It just really is a great synthesizer. It has a very unique sound. It enables you to do some really cool things. And I'm just a huge fan and have a nostalgic affinity for this instrument because, I've been playing it since it first came out. In fact, probably started on the Blue Marvin and then played every iteration going forward. So let me tell you a little bit about my perspective on the 2600 as a composer and as a keyboard player and synthesist. Generally speaking, to me, the 2600 is a lot more than just sample and hold and patch chords and cool pictures and R2D2 sounds, right? All those cliche things with the older analog synthesizers. If you know how to use it, the 2600 really can be a deep well of sonic possibilities and an endless source of inspiration. The instrument really enables me to create some very unique textures in my music, regardless of the genre, whether I'm doing jazz fusion or I'm writing music for a game or TV score or film score. It really gives me some unique sonic possibilities to be able to do that. From a creative standpoint, it enables me to really diversify and enhance my sonic palette, giving me more tones and textures and layers that I can kind of bring to a piece of music. And we'll talk about sonic palette in just a minute. It also enables me to differentiate. By using this instrument in very unique and creative ways, it enables me to sound different and stand out from other composers. Hopefully in a better way, but certainly gives me the ability to just differentiate myself from everybody else that's out there. The 2600, and we'll see this in the kind of the use cases in a minute, really enables me to really be kind of overt, where yeah, that's a synthesizer, that sounds super cool, to more of the subtle cases where I'm using it to enhance the string section or brass samples or whatever it may be. And really, it also gives me the opportunity to create some really unique leads and bass sounds, and particularly if I'm layering the 2600 with other instruments. One of my favorite kind of go-to things is, particularly in scoring or in kind of the jazz and rock genres, is layer the 2600 with other analog or even digital synthesizers. But one of my favorites is layering the 2600 with a Mini Moog, or the 2600 with the Moog Modular, or the Prophet 5 or Oberheim or whatever it may be. It just plays well sonically with other analog synthesizers. So I just think that's a really cool thing, and I would encourage you to try to do that if you can. Lastly, from a practical standpoint, the 2600 gives me the ability to fatten up my orchestral samples, add some subtle depth to a particular piece of music, and take common orchestral cues to a new level just by using this instrument. And it really does enhance my sonic palette, which kind of leads me to the next topic that I'd love to talk about, which is the sonic palette. So I refer, to the sonic palette very similar to how an artist works with paints, right? So the palette is used to kind of hold and mix all your different colors for the artist, and they're able to use that to create unique blends of different colors for their painting. Well, in our case, it's not much different, right? We're using a sonic palette, and that's the sounds that you would use to compose or perform your music. And sometimes it's a conscious thing, sometimes it's an unconscious thing. For me, it's a very conscious thing. And I always think about, what is my sonic palette? What kind of music do I write and compose? And what are the instruments that typically make up my, template in my DAW, for example. So I've got numerous templates that I use depending on the style of music that I'm going to write. And within that template, there might be strings and brass, all the orchestral stuff, and some unique ethnic percussion, and maybe a couple of synthesizers. And then maybe if I'm doing something that's jazz fusion or rock, that's going to be more heavy on the synthesizer side. But it's my palette or template that I use to create my music. And I think the palette or your musical sonic palette is very unique to each individual composer. And I would encourage you to think about these things. Like I said, what kind of music do you write and compose? What are the instruments that are currently in your DAW template or palette? What's your sound? Everybody has a sound, right? I have a unique sound. You have a unique sound. When you think about Keith Emerson, he's got a unique sound. Rick Wakeman has a unique sound. John Williams has a unique sound. Hans Zimmer has a unique sound. All of us have this very unique, and I'm not equating myself quality-wise with these guys, but from the perspective of a sound, they all have a unique sound, which is their palette, which is what they work from to deliver the music that they're composing. So think about, what are the sounds that I need to convey in my music? What sound do I want to define me? Do I want it to be synth heavy? Do I want it to be more orchestral heavy? Do I want any synthesizers in it? It doesn't really matter. What matters is what is it that helps you do what you do? And in this particular kind of discussion, we're talking about the 2600. And for me, that is part of my sonic palette. So I encourage you to think about that. And if you haven't thought about it, to go back and look at your body of work. I bet you'll find that there is these kind of things that make you unique. And it doesn't apply to just keyboard players and synthesists, right? If you're a guitar player or tuba player, there may be some unique things that you do that is part of your sonic palette, the way you voice things, the way you perform things, and the sounds that you use or the textures that you use. So I think it's really important to think about that, particularly when we're talking about synthesizers. So let's get into kind of the meat of Synthesizer 101 for the composer and what we're talking about here, because this all plays a role in that sonic palette. And what I want to talk about here is just very high level functionality and characteristics of the 2600 for kind of the composer and the musician, right? I mean, it can apply to anybody, but we're really talking about composers kind of in this case, or at least that's who I was initially talking to and about. So one of the most important things in a synthesizer, in my opinion, is the oscillators and the filters. Those are what kind of make the sonic characteristic of the instrument. It's what makes an ARP sound like an ARP, and why a Moog sounds like a Moog, and why an Oberheim sounds like an Oberheim, right? It's the oscillators and the filters, and from my perspective. And understanding what waveforms your oscillators can produce can help you very quickly start creating the sounds that you're trying to get to. So in this case, the 2600 has 3 voltage controlled oscillators, and they can create, the sine wave, square wave, triangle, sawtooth, and pulse wave. It also has pulse width modulation, so you can do some unique things with the pulse wave. But generally speaking, these are the waveforms that the 2600 produces. Now, why is this important? From my perspective, understanding what the waveform looks like and what it sounds like can help you generate and create patches very quickly, particularly certain sounds. So if you know, hey, I need to create this sound or that sound, if you understand what the sonic characteristics and what the visual characteristics of a waveform are, that can help you quickly produce those sounds. Now, this is just the way I kind of grew up understanding and learning about subtractive synthesis. You got to remember, back when I started learning how to use synthesizers were just coming out. So there wasn't a huge body of knowledge on how to create sounds and all these things. So I kind of learned intuitively how to do this. So I'm going to share with you kind of the way I look at this, and maybe that will help you as you try to develop more sounds and expand your sonic palette. So let's talk about the sine wave, right? Probably the most common waveform synthesizer, or at least analog synthesizers, create. So if we look at the waveform itself, you can see that it's kind of a smooth, uniformed waveform. And from a sonic standpoint, this waveform is used to create, bass sounds, bells, pianos, organs, pads, flutes, very rounded sounds. In contrast, we look at the next waveform, which is the square wave, right? That's a very reedy, hollow sounding waveform. So we see what that looks like, and then when we match a sonic characteristic to it, we think of instruments like the clarinet or, that Lyle Mays Oberheim Prophet, kind of lead sound that he was noted for. When we think of a triangle wave, again, we look at it visually and we think about, well, this is a waveform that is typically used to create strings and lead sounds and pad sounds and those kind of sonic characteristics. And then finally, again, one of the most common waveforms is a sawtooth. And that's typically used to create brass, horns, strings, leads, basses. And all of these waveforms have very unique sonic characteristics to it. So again, I would encourage you in your mind, like I do, I see the waveform in my head and I match it to the sonic characteristic. And then you could be saying, well, that's great, Dave, but show me the sonic characteristics. Well, since you asked, let's take a listen. So this is the sine wave. So the sine wave, as you just heard, is a very kind of rounded, warm, full-bodied sound. But when we take a listen to the square wave, you'll hear that this is a reedy, hollow sound. Let's take a listen. And now we'll take a listen to the triangle. Kind of like a hybrid between the sawtooth and the sine wave. Now, let's kind of finish up these examples with the sawtooth wave. So after listening to those things, you can, I'm assuming, like me, you'd be able to hear the differences, right? So when we think about the sine wave, you can see and hear how that would be used for bells and bass and organ and pads. Same thing with sawtooth. Well, the sonic characteristics make it similar to like how I would want a string sound to be made or a brass sound to be made. So what I want to do now is, now that we've kind of identified what they look like and what their sonic characteristics are, let's take a listen to how these actually can work in a real scenario of creating a sound. So the first example I want to share with you is we're going to use one voltage controlled oscillator generating a sine wave to create a very simple basic bass sound. So in your mind, when you're listening to this, I want you to think about what the waveform looks like and match it to kind of what these sonic characteristics are for this particular bass sound. Super, super simple, very basic, one oscillator, sine wave bass sound. So now what I want to do is use two oscillators using both sine waves. And what I've done here is I've slightly detuned the oscillators to do or to accomplish two things. One, I want to fatten up that bass sound, make it sound a little bit wider, a little bit bigger. And I've also detuned it just enough to put those oscillators out of phase in a way. And what that does is it creates the sonic illusion of movement, almost like an auto pan type of effect. So I want you to listen. Again, this is about as simple gets, right? Two oscillators, both sine waves. I've detuned each oscillator to fatten it up and to create this movement. Now take a listen and you can hear kind of what that effect is. So the next example we're going to take a quick listen to is, again, two oscillators, one with a sine wave, one with a sawtooth, right? So this is kind of a bass sound. The oscillators are slightly detuned, but each waveform is very clearly defined. So you'll be able to hear at the bottom end that sine wave, and then at the higher end, and more aggressively, that sawtooth wave. Now, what I'm trying to do here is I want you to kind of hear how these two waveforms work together and give you a distinct kind of breakout of what the sine wave sounds like and what the sawtooth sounds like. So let's take a listen to this example. Again, we're still doing things at a very rudimentary level, super simple, super easy, but by using these kind of waveforms, we can create some really interesting, bass sounds. So now we're going to change it up a little bit here. So I'm using 3 voltage-controlled oscillators. One's with a sine wave, one's generating a sawtooth, the other's generating a square wave that I've slightly detuned and I've octave up. I've added some spring reverb and a little bit of portamento. Again, this is about as simple gets, but really what it does is it's kind of created this, kind of Chick Corea, Return to Forever kind of lead sound, or Jeff Lorber kind of lead vibe. But again, super simple. 3 oscillators, 3 different waveforms, slightly detuned with a little bit of spring reverb and a little bit of portamento. Let's take a listen. All right, now we're going to move on to kind of the quintessential, fat analog synthesizer bass sound. So again, in this case, I'm using 3 oscillators, a sine wave, a sawtooth, and a square wave. I've slightly detuned all of them, again, to make it fatter. But again, we're keeping things real simple here, but by doing so, we're able to create this nice fat 3 oscillator bass sound. You've heard this sound millions of times, right? It's used probably in thousands of pieces of music. So let's take a listen. Now, what's interesting here from a sonic perspective is this. I want you to think about kind of what I thought about when I created this sound. So when I created this sound, I'm using the sine wave to give me a fat bottom, right? It's a rounded sound, it's nice and fat, it fills out and gives that bass sound some beef. I'm using the sawtooth to give me a little more of that bite and that aggression, and I've used the square wave to just kind of fill in the middle. So if you imagine the sounds as a pyramid, that sine wave would be the bottom part of the pyramid, the square wave would be the middle part of the pyramid, and the sawtooth would be at the top of the pyramid, sonically. So the sawtooth's giving me some aggression and bite, the square wave is just kind of rounding out the middle, and I'm using that sine wave to create that kind of fatness at the bottom end. All right, let's finish up with the last example, which is 2 VCOs. One is creating the sine wave, the other is creating the square wave. Now, what I've tried to do here is use this example to create kind of that typical analog clarinet sound. Now, this one's a little bit more complicated because I'm using the LFO to create a vibrato effect, and I'm using the ADSR, just like I did in that last example, to give a little bit of a bite into the sound. But again, we're still keeping it real simple here. 2 oscillators, sine wave, square wave, clarinet sound with a little bit of LFO for the vibrato. So let's take a listen to this one. So very, very simple. But all of these examples are super simple. But what I really wanted you to take away from this is understanding what those waveforms sound like, what they look like, so that you can not only sonically visualize, but also in your mind visualize what those waveforms are. And what I've found, at least in my experience, is it's helped me be able to craft and dial up patches very quickly, knowing, hey, if I need to create a bass patch quickly, I know I'm probably going to go right to a sine wave and probably to a sawtooth, and then maybe I'll see what I'll do with that third oscillator. So because I know what the sonic characteristics are of those waveforms. So hopefully that helps you understand just at a very high level kind of how those work, and maybe that will help you generate sounds and be able to dial up patches a lot quicker when you're doing that. And more importantly, when you're trying to figure out, do I want the synthesizer to be prominent in the mix as a lead instrument or doubling instrument, or do I want it to be something that's going to add kind of some bottom to a piece of music? All right, let's talk about the ADSR at a super, super high level. Right, so ADSR stands for attack, decay, sustain, and release. Most synthesizers will have an ADSR or an AR, attack and release. The 2600 has both an AR and an ADSR. And really the ADSR, or the envelope, is again another way to kind of contour the sound or the individual note of an instrument. Again, kind of matching that visual to sonic relationship. When you think about the ADSR, you think about, or I'd like you to think about, how a certain sound sounds utilizing this envelope model, right? So if it's a piano sound, obviously it has a sharp attack, medium decay, sustain, and then, depending on if you want to simulate sustain as in the sustain pedal, then it would have a longer release. Or if you think about kind of string sounds or pad sounds, where you're going to want to have a longer attack where the sound slowly comes in and maybe has a longer release point. So the ADSR, again, gives you the ability to contour the loudness of that particular sound that you're working on. And fortunately for the 2600, you have a full ADSR and an AR. So again, I don't want to go too deep into subtractive synthesis, but you can have one oscillator assigned to the ADSR, another oscillator assigned to the AR, and create some really unique effects on the particular sound and waveform. The last thing I want to talk about is just the filter, and we're not going to get into too much detail other than to say that the 2600 has a variety of different filters on it that enable you to contour the sound and the waveform even further. And as I said at the beginning of this kind of Synthesis 101 section, oscillators and filters to me are the most important parts of the instrument. It's what gives that sonic characteristic to the instrument, what makes an ARP sound like an ARP, and what makes a Moog sound like a Moog. So having said that, I didn't want to go too deep on it, but hopefully that gives you enough information, if you're not overly familiar with subtractive synthesis, to start thinking about how to create these sounds and what the sonic characteristics are and the waveform characteristics are to help you create, again, whether you want to create a clarinet or you want to create strings or you want to create brass or just some really cool lead sounds. Now, hopefully, you'll have a better foundation in which to kind of attack that. All right, let's move into really what the meat of this presentation is about, which is using your ARP 2600 for visual media scoring. So we've got 4 examples that I kind of want to walk you through. And the first 2 are what I would refer to as overt use cases. I want the 2600 to be prominent in the mix, and it plays a critical role in the mix. So let's go to the first example, which is kind of what I call the superhero example. Again, overt use case. The objective of using the 2600 here is to enhance the orchestra, add some fatness to the bottom of the piece of music, and use kind of these unique synthesizer sounds to quote-unquote modernize the cue. So what we're going to do is take a listen to just the orchestral mix. Right? So we've got the brass ensemble, we've got the percussion, we've got choir, we've got cello, and a bunch of other string stuff happening here. So I just kind of want you to hear that without the 2600 first. So let's take a listen. All right, so now we're going to kind of attack the 2600. So here I've used 4 different 2600 tracks. And what I've got going on is a couple of things, right? So I've got this, a patch I've created that I just love, I use a lot. It's kind of a fat bottom bass legato type of sound that uses all 3 oscillators. I've used the LFO to kind of create this pulsing kind of vibe. It's a very cool sound that I use quite a bit. I've created another synthesizer kind of lead sound that's going to double the brass part. And then I've got, the traditional filter sweep. And then I've got another kind of lead sound where I'm doing this kind of octave thing with portamento to just kind of really, again, get some movement going on with this. So why don't we take a listen to the 2600 mix alone. And you can hear kind of in that brass doubling part, I've detuned the hell out of the oscillators, almost making them out of tune. But the objective there was to just create some kind of movement. And with all these examples, the 2600 would never be this prominent in the mix. It would probably be mixed, obviously, a lot better. But for this kind of exercise, I wanted you to be able to hear it a little more in the mix. So let's take a listen to the end result of the orchestra with the 2600, again with the objective of enhancing this piece of music, adding some fatness to it, and some unique synthesizer sounds to kind of modernize and make it this kind of superhero vibe. All right, let's take a listen to this. There is our ARP superhero theme using the 2600 in an overt manner. So let's move on to the next one, which is kind of an action drama cue. Again, an overt use case. I want you to hear the synthesizer in this piece of music. And really, I'm using the 2600 specifically to do the following. I want to add some kind of movement in the piece of music, and I really want this syncopated electronic groove going on in the background. And essentially, the objective is to add a little more drama and a little more action suspense in this piece of music. So the orchestral side of the music is pretty straightforward, right? There's kind of a simple percussive groove, right? We've got some timpani going on, and we've got some brass and string hits. So what I want to do is take a listen to the orchestra with just one 2600. I just used a simple sequence pattern in the background, right? So let's take a listen to that just to see kind of what we're dealing with here. All right, so that's kind of the first example. I'll give you 10 points for Gryffindor if you can tell me what waveforms I used on that simple sequence. If you said sine wave and square wave, then you are correct. Okay, moving on. So I created 4 2600 parts for this cue. As you heard in the last example, again, it's pretty sparse, very simple percussion, just a couple of brass and string stabs in there. It wasn't happening, right? So we're going to add this 2600 to kind of make this thing move, have a little bit of syncopation, and give it a little more drama and action suspense vibe. So in this case, I've created 3 different sequenced patterns, and I'm going back to my favorite kind of what I call LFO drone bass sound, just to kind of get that movement going and kind of syncopating with that orchestral and sampled percussion. So in this particular case, let's just take a listen to the 2600 tracks alone, and then we'll move on. So here's just the 2600 tracks. All right, so we got a lot of stuff going on there, but when we put it together with the orchestra, the cue, as we say in TV and film scoring, or the actual piece of music, actually starts to come alive a little bit more, and hopefully I've achieved the objective of adding that kind of electronic groove, a little more drama, and a little bit more action and suspense. So let's take a listen to kind of the full mix, and we'll see if we got there. All right, so that wraps up our two overt use cases where I really wanted the 2600 to sound like a 2600 and kind of sit a little bit more prominent in the mix. I wanted you to know that there's a synthesizer going on somewhere in this piece of music. So now we're going to move on to kind of the more subtle approaches of how to use the 2600. So in this case, I kind of did a little bit of a James Bond 00 ARP vibe. And really my objective here is to kind of fatten the string samples up, to give me a little bit of depth, to make those strings a little bit wider and breathe a little bit more, and then ultimately create some subtle artificial dynamics, because I did not program or play any dynamics into the string samples. So let's go ahead and take a listen to just the orchestra and see kind of what we're dealing with here. All right, generally speaking, sounds pretty cool. We could probably live with that, add some dynamics, clean it up a little bit, be pretty cool. But again, in this case, we want those strings to kind of breathe a little bit more, have a little more of an attack, fatten them up and widen them out a little bit. So I'm using the 2600 to accomplish this. Now, I want you to be prepared, and because you're going to be underwhelmed, right? This is going to sound like what you would expect analog synthesizer of the 2600 style to create. But again, the objective here is not for the 2600 to supplant or replace my strings, but to create that subtle depth and artificial dynamics. And I think it's important to just listen to the underwhelming string sound from the 2600. So let's take a listen to that first. So you can hear there's a little bit of delay on there, but generally speaking, the oscillators are heavily detuned, and we got that thing nice and wide. So now I want to play for you just the 2600 and the string mix, because this will give you an or at least a good idea of what we were trying to accomplish and what the end result is isolated with just the strings in the 2600. So here we go. So hopefully you're able to hear how those strings got much wider. They breathe a little bit more. By utilizing the ADSR, I've been able to kind of create a little bit of that bowing effect on the strings with the 2600, and to essentially reach the objective that we were trying to do. Fatten them up, add some depth, and some artificial dynamics. So now let's take a listen to all of it put together and see if we've actually accomplished the objective. So pretty cool. So there's an example of using the 2600 to just kind of sweeten up, a particular part. And again, it doesn't have to be strings. It could be anything, right? It could be doubling a bass line. It could be doubling a guitar line, whatever it may be. But using that instrument, i.e. the 2600, in a manner that maybe is a little bit different than you would normally use it. All right, let's wrap up these subtle use cases with one more example of using the 2600 to kind of make these brass samples sound a little more natural. So in this case, this is kind of a fanfare kind of vibe with brass. The objective is to use the 2600 to fatten those brass samples, add some depth. Again, I've used the ADSR to create some volume and some timbre changes in the dynamics. I've detuned the hell out of the oscillators to, again, give it a wider effect. And just really try to make those brass samples sound just a little more natural. They don't sound bad as they are, but in this use case, this is the objective that we're trying to go after. So let's take a listen to just the orchestral mix, right? We got orchestral percussion, brass ensemble, and string ensemble. Okay, overall, pretty decent. We can live with that, clean it up a little bit, we'll be good to go. But in this case, we're trying to do something here with the 2600. So let's isolate and just listen to the orchestral brass. And so you can hear kind of what we're dealing with, and then ultimately what it will sound like once we add the 2600. So here's just the orchestral brass. All right. So again, be prepared to be grossly underwhelmed. All right, we're going to add the 2600 brass. But again, the objective here is not to supplant or replace the brass, but to enhance it by using the 2600. So let's take a listen to the brass patch that I've dialed up, and we'll take a listen. Here we go. Okay, so as you can hear, I've used the ADSR for a slower attack. I've used the spring reverb just to give it a little bit of verb. And I detuned the hell out of the oscillators to make it sound a little bit wider. And again, almost to the point of, not quite out of tune, but getting pretty damn close. The objective for that is, again, when layered with the samples, it's creating kind of the illusion of natural movement of a brass section. And that slower attack kind of creates the illusion that the horn section has some level of dynamics written into their chart. So let's just take a listen to the orchestra and the 2600 brass, and you'll kind of see the effect I was trying to go for, and then we'll take a listen to the full mix. Here's just the orchestra and 2600. now the final mix. And there you have it. That is 4 examples of how to potentially use the 2600 in visual media scoring, right? 2 examples of kind of obvious synthesizer in your cue, and 2 examples of how to kind of layer the instrument in a subtle manner to bring certain instruments or certain parts to life, or to just bring a little more something to it that you may have been missing. Hopefully that gives you a good idea, or at least inspires you to look at how to use the 2600 maybe a little bit differently than you would normally use it. And certainly these are some ways, not all the ways, but some ways in which I use the 2600 in my music. Now you could say, well, Dave, I mean, if you're using brass samples, and you're using high quality brass samples, which I do, you just use your mod wheel or slider to, add dynamics. And yes, of course, you can do all those things, right? But the objective of what we're talking about here is ways in which to use the 2600 to do that. And even if I did use those natural dynamics in the sample library, or I was working with a real, brass section, still being able to do things with the 2600 like that really creates unique effects. And when we're talking about TV and film and game scoring, sometimes you want a different sound. Yes, it's a brass section, but maybe it has something really unique to it that you're like, man, I don't know what the hell they did to that, but that sounds so cool. How did they get the horns to sound like that? Well, this may be one of the ways in which they do that. And obviously, Hans is noted for using synthesizers very creatively like that. Tom Halkenberg, and there's so many other composers that really have found unique ways to use the synthesizer along with the orchestral components of the cue. So I hope that was helpful, and I hope that inspired you to think differently and maybe kind of go back and dust off the old analogs, or fire them up and start using them. So now let's kind of move into the last section of this presentation, which is kind of best practices, the things that I always think about, the things that I'm always focused on anytime I'm using old analog gear. I think it's critically important to keep your power clean, right? Especially on old analog synthesizers. Nobody likes 60 cycle hums. You'll drive your engineer crazy. You'll drive yourself crazy. So, try to keep your power as clean as possible. Keep all your pots clean, right? The 2600's got a lot of sliders on it. Other synthesizers have both sliders and, potentiometers and rotary knobs and all the fun stuff. And if they get dirty, they make a lot of noise, and noise is not your friend. If you're dealing with older synthesizers, let them warm up before you tune. ARPs less so, other synthesizers more so. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and we won't get into. But if you know, you know. But let them warm up, right? Voltage-controlled oscillators need time to warm up and stabilize. And it's really important before you start tuning and getting ready to play with other musicians. You're in tune when you start, and you're out of tune when you don't. So let those things warm up. This is obvious. Use quality cables, right? Crappy cables make noise. And again, noise is your enemy. No noise. What I was just talking about, tune your synthesizer to A440, assuming that's what everybody's playing in, with a single oscillator, right? Use one single oscillator as your root tuning after your synth is warmed up, and then tune the other oscillators from that point on. That way you've got a nice, in-tune, stable oscillator in which to tune the rest of the instrument. Again, not to be redundant, but tune again before you record and tune again before you perform. Nobody likes out-of-tune musicians. And when you're dealing with old analog synthesizers, this obviously can become an issue. If you don't believe me, just Google pictures of Keith Emerson's Moog Modular. You'll usually see a tuner sitting next to it, because that thing would go out of tune all the damn time. Service your gear, right? Keep it in working order. You certainly don't want it to crap out in the gig, especially if it's an older analog synthesizer like a 2600 or a Mini Moog or whatever it may be. These things are old, so make sure they're kept in working order and serviced, and that way the gig will go well. If you're using a 2600 and you've got spring reverb, don't jolt it, and shake it and hit it, unless you want thunder sounds, right? Spring reverbs, as we all know, can make some pretty cool effects, but that's the last damn thing you need when you're in the middle of a session or dubbing session and you're laying stuff down. Okay, let's talk about some general best practices, when using the 2600. Again, this stuff may be obvious to you, but just hear me out on it, because to some people it might not be. So when using multiple oscillators, I love to detune them just a little bit, right? It fattens them up, creates unique space. If you play around with them, right, you can get some really unique effects, like we saw earlier in the presentation, where you can kind of get that auto panning effect just by putting the oscillators slightly out of sync. And you also can create some really cool tunings, right? One oscillator to the root, the other oscillator to the fifth, the other oscillator to whatever. You can create some really cool things just by tuning, or the way you tune your oscillators. Again, when using multiple oscillators, set the oscillators at different transposition ranges to create some unique textures and depth. Again, this stuff seems like it would be common sense, but not always. So play around with that. I think a lot of times you can create very unique sounds and textures just through tuning and adjusting the octave ranges. Clearly, mixing waveform types to create unique textures is a really cool thing to do. And again, hopefully you were paying attention in the section where we were listening to and looking at the different waveforms, so you know what those characteristics are. So if I mix a sine wave with a square wave, or a sine wave with a sawtooth, I can create these really unique, rich textures. I'll also say this: be very careful when layering or doubling the 2600 or any analog synthesizer with orchestra or with orchestral samples. Sometimes you can get some really funky tuning issues where things are slightly out of tune. So just be careful with that, just a word of caution. Again, pulse width modulation can really give you some unique sound texture, so I would encourage you to play with that. Also working with the LFO. The LFO can create some really cool things, whether it's vibrato, whether it's just slightly pulsing. A particular sound can give you some really unique effects that can make that track or that cue pop. I really love using portamento. Not always, but whether it's a lead sound or bass sounds, it can create some really neat effects, even on strings, right? When you're using slight portamento and you're playing different string lines or whatnot, it just gives, or it helps give a little more of a natural feel to legato and those kind of things. If you're using VST or MIDI versions, layering them with other synthesizers is a lot of fun and creates some unique textures. I'm a big fan of doing that kind of thing, whether it's in the DAW or whether it's manual. Using your 2600 to layer or double orchestral parts. As we saw, you can do some really cool things, make the orchestra sound a little bit different, or make those orchestral samples sound a little more natural. Again, I just caution you, be careful of the tuning. And ultimately, look, have fun, be inspired, don't be intimidated by all the sliders and all the hieroglyphics on the front of it, right? Just play around with it, dial up a sine wave and then start screwing around and see what sounds cool. This is supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be inspiring. So don't be intimidated by that stuff. So those are kind of my creative and functional, practical best practices. Again, I apologize if many of these things are kind of common sense or you're aware of them. Some people may not be, so hopefully you were able to take something away from that. And now let's kind of move on to the most controversial part of my presentation and kind of the whole synthesizer world, which is this: real versus clone versus VST, and what my perspective is on these things. So, I literally, as you know, grew up with ARP synthesizers from when they first, I started playing on the 2500 and the Soloist, and then kind of, moved on to the other ones as they came out, and literally had them in my basement and I would be playing them. So for me, not only do I have a natural affinity to ARP synthesizers, but it's very nostalgic for me. I have a very warm heart or spot in my heart for these instruments because I grew up with them. I played them. I learned everything I know on them. So it's important for me that these instruments survive. And I think Korg did a great job with their clone of the 2600 or whatever you want to call it, replica. TTSH has done a great job. I think Behringer, making a pseudo 2600 that's affordable to people is super cool, and I applaud them for doing that. I think Arturia has done an amazing job, with their VSTs and way out where, they had a great 2600. So for people who are interested in the 2600, there's so many different avenues for you to be able to actually use this instrument and create these sounds. And it's obviously hard for people to get a real 2600, so damn expensive, and there's not that many of them around, and even the Korg clone one is still crazy expensive. So it's not as readily available to the masses as, say, some of the other ones are. But kudos to everybody. Great job. It's enabled more and more people to kind of experience and play and interact with some facsimile of the ARP 2600. So I always get asked, hey Dave, we know your history with ARP and your dad and blah, blah, blah. Do you still use ARP synthesizers and what do you think? And, and I answer it this way. My perspective is much different now than it would have been earlier, because earlier in my career, when I was doing more session work and that kind of stuff and playing more, obviously having all these synthesizers around me was really important to me, both from a tactile standpoint, but also from a performance standpoint. But as I started doing more and more film composing and game composing and TV composing and composing for media, a lot of things changed, right? Your timeline in which to turn music around is radically different than it would be if I was doing session work. And the complexities of what I do, and any composer for visual media does, is very complex. You can get changes very quickly, and you might have a cue where you've got all kinds of things happening, and then all of a sudden the timing, they come back to you and say, hey, what was 36 seconds is now 18.9 seconds. But yet we still want you to do kind of the same thing. And so being able to change and make changes on the fly and do that under pressure and under a short timeline, my workflow and use cases change dramatically. So when people ask me what my choice is, I go to Arturia. I think Arturia's products are phenomenal. All of their synthesizer, VSTs are amazing. I'm blown away by them. And I'll tell you why I've kind of gone to this. And you might say, oh my God, well, you used to play them and now you're using software. Well, like I said, my use case has changed. Do I still like to go and touch them and feel them and move sliders and patch chords and all that fun stuff? Absolutely. Absolutely. From the nostalgic standpoint, it's again, it's family. It's what I grew up with. But to do the work that I do, the VSTs are far more effective. And I'll tell you why. There's a bunch of reasons why these things are effective to me. Stable oscillators, number one, right? I don't ever have to worry about them going out of tune. Number two, the features and functionality are amazing, right? The sequencer, I've got some rudimentary DSP right in the VST. I've got filters. I can save my patches, right? So now I've got presets, where on the original 2600, I got to pull out my patch book and try to remember what the hell I did and all that fun stuff. Now, everything saves with my sequence. So I don't ever have to worry about, oh man, what patch did I use there and how did I do that? That's really important to me because, again, just timing of how quickly I've got to turn things around. The less things that make it complicated, the better for me. So stable oscillators, having this sequencer, DSP filters is really important. As I talked about, patch memory, huge, right? I can save everything I've done, not just in the sequence, but I can create all kinds of banks of sounds. I can take my custom patch book, put them into the Arturia 2600 and save all my patches, and I can literally mouse click away, dial them up. Polyphony, this is a huge thing. You're probably thinking, how did Dave get, all those chords with the strings and the horns? Well, this is how I do it, right? I have unlimited polyphony with my VST, which is super cool, right? That unlimited polyphony, patch memory, right there in and of itself is a huge win for me in what I do and the way I work. Clean signal path. I don't have to worry about, challenges with noise and patch cords and, all that crazy stuff. Everything is super clean right in my DAW. Seamless integration with my DAW. Again, this is critically important to kind of the work that I do and the way that I work. I get very impatient. If technology doesn't work, I have a very violent reaction. I don't smash stuff up, but I get really frustrated because my brain's trying to work faster than my body can keep up with. And having everything seamlessly integrated into my DAW and not having to worry about external sync boxes and, MIDI retro kits and all this other crazy stuff, everything's right in my box, makes it so much easier for me to do the work that I need to do. I can have unlimited 2600s, and I can map and sync all my sequences, all the LFO functionality, filter modulation, all that stuff can not only be tempo synced, but can be synced in how I'm playing and mapped to, my mod wheels and sliders and all kinds of crazy stuff. And as I said, the ability to have hundreds of 2600s. I might have a queue that has 15 2600s or 10 2600s, a Moog modular, and 3 mini Moogs. Well, obviously I couldn't have that in my studio. Actually, I couldn't afford all those synthesizers, but it'd be a nightmare to try to get them all to work together. With this situation, it makes it so much easier because I literally can have hundreds of 2600s. So let me give you some shameless promotion here. When we talk about programming the 2600 and that stuff, I understand not everybody, is a master of subtractive synthesis. Not everybody has had the ability that I had to grow up with these synthesizers. So what I've done is I've created, what I call the Signature Series patch books. So I've created one, actually 3 for the 2600. The main one is, I believe, over 350 pages. It's got never before seen content in it. It's got some custom patch templates in there that you can create your own patches and write them out. It's got a ton of historical ARP information, images, all kinds of archival stuff that no one in the world has. That's always interesting if you're interested in ARP history and ARP synthesizers. There are some ARP VIP patches that my dad created back in the 70s that were only given to top name artists that were using the 2600. That's in the patch book. There's a bunch of custom patches that I've created that are in the patch book. The original ARP 2600 patch book is included, including the service manual and a whole bunch more. It's only $49 if that's something you're interested in. Definitely go to dfmgsignaturesfx.com. There you'll find that patch book. You'll find my patch book for the Mini Moog, the CAT SRM. You'll also find 2 other ARP 2600 patch books. One is all bass sounds, one's all lead sounds, and a whole bunch of other stuff, Ableton loop libraries, all that fun stuff. So again, shameless promotion, but if this stuff is of interest to you, I think you'll really dig it. So what I'd like to do is kind of conclude this and wrap all this up with another piece of music that I wrote for this presentation called Dr. What. Again, orchestra, 2600 in your face, kind of a Doctor Who kind of vibe, but I hope you enjoy it. I hope this was helpful to you, and I hope it inspires you to use not just the 2600, but a lot of these principles apply to any analog synthesizer, or frankly, any other synthesizer. But in this case, I hope you found it valuable, and I hope you found it inspirational. Thank you for taking a little bit of over an hour of your time to spend with me, and I appreciate it. So best of luck, and here we go with Dr. Watt.